I've always been a light sleeper, the kind who wakes up at the slightest noise. Living alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building in the city, this wasn't always a good thing. The walls were paper thin, and I could hear everything. My neighbors arguing, the TV in the apartment next door, even the faint murmur of traffic from the street below. It was a constant background noise that I had grown used to over the years. But one night, something was different. It was a Wednesday, and I had come home late from work, exhausted after a long day. I didn't bother with dinner, just microwaved some leftovers and ate them on the couch while mindlessly flipping through TV channels. The thought of crawling into bed was the only thing keeping me going. By the time I finally made it to bed, it was past midnight. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, my mind buzzing with thoughts of work and the monotony of my routine. Eventually, I must have drifted off, but it wasn't long before I woke up to a strange sound. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the hum of the city outside. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just one of the usual noises, the creak of the building settling or a neighbor moving around. But as I lay there in the darkness, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a soft, persistent scratching, like fingernails dragging across a hard surface. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to race. The sound was coming from the window. My bedroom window faced the alley behind the building. There wasn't much to see out there, just a narrow strip of pavement and the brick walls of the adjacent buildings. The fire escape was the only thing that broke the monotony, a rickety metal structure that hadn't been used in years. I had always kept the window locked, a habit formed more out of a vague sense of caution than any real fear. After all, who would bother climbing up 3 stories to break into a tiny apartment like mine? But now, as I sat there in the dark, listening to that eerie scratching, I wasn't so sure. I forced myself to move, slowly sliding out of bed. The floor was cold under my feet as I crept toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching had stopped, but I could still hear something. A faint rustling, like someone shifting their weight on the metal grates of the fire escape. I reached the window and hesitated. The curtains were drawn, and I could see the faint outline of the fire escape through the thin fabric. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just the wind or maybe a stray cat. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the curtain and pulled it aside. My blood ran cold. There, standing on the fire escape, was a man. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but I could make out enough to know he was looking directly at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and he was pressed up against the glass. His hands splayed out on either side of the window frame. I froze, too terrified to move. The man didn't say anything, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Then, as if realizing I was fully awake and aware of his presence, the man did something that sent a wave of pure terror through me. He tested the window. His fingers curled around the edge of the frame, and he pushed gently at first, then harder, as if trying to see if it would give way. Thank God I had locked it. I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing with what to do. My phone was on the nightstand, but the thought of reaching for it terrified me. What if he saw me move? What if he realized I was going to call for help? I couldn't take that chance. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The man continued to press against the window, his eyes never leaving mine. I could see his breath fogging up the glass, the cold night air seeping through the thin barrier that separated us. For a brief, horrifying moment, I thought the window might actually give way, that he would somehow force it open and climb inside. But then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped. He let go of the window frame, his hands dropping to his sides. He took a step back, still watching me. And then he did something that made my blood turn to ice. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a slow, deliberate curl of the lips, a smile that spoke of something dark, something sinister. He held my gaze for a moment longer, and then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the fire escape. I didn't move, couldn't. I stood there, staring at the empty fire escape, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. It felt like hours before I finally had the courage to step back from the window and grab my phone. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to dial 911. When the operator answered, I could barely speak. I stammered out what had happened, my voice trembling with fear. They assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity before I finally heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the area, the man was long gone. They found no trace of him, no evidence that he had even been there. The fire escape was old and rusted, and they told me it was unlikely anyone could have climbed up without making a lot of noise. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't my imagination. The police took my statement, reassured me that they would keep an eye on the area, and advised me to keep my windows locked. But as they left, I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe me. They thought it was just a case of an overactive imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the isolation of living alone. But I knew better. I knew that somewhere out there, that man was still lurking, watching, waiting. The thought of him returning, of him trying to get in again, kept me awake for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of my bedroom, clutching my phone, my eyes glued to the window. In the days that followed, I became paranoid. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart jump. I started sleeping with the lights on, double-checking the locks on my doors and windows before I went to bed. I even bought a security camera and installed it on the fire escape just in case. But the man never came back. Weeks passed, and slowly I began to let my guard down. I convinced myself that it had been a one-time thing, that maybe he was just a homeless person looking for shelter, or a thief trying to find an easy target. Maybe he had moved on to another building, another victim. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I knew that smile, that twisted, knowing smile, was meant for me. It was a promise, a warning. And so I live with the fear that one day he will return. That one night, I'll wake up to the sound of scratching at my window, and this time I won't be so lucky. This is my reality now. A life lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because once you've seen the night watcher, you can never forget him, and you can never escape him. It was a chilly October evening when I first noticed the smell. At first, I thought it was just the usual autumn musk, the damp, earthy smell of decaying leaves and the crispness of the changing season. But this odor was different, more pungent and unsettling. It seemed to seep into every corner of my home, no matter how many windows I opened or how much air freshener I used. The scent was unmistakable, a nauseating combination of rot and decay. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a temporary issue, but as days went by, the smell only grew stronger. It was as if it were emanating from the walls themselves. My neighbors, whom I spoke to about the issue, hadn't noticed anything unusual. It seemed I was the only one affected. Determined to find the source of the odor, I began a thorough inspection of my house. I checked the attic, basement, and even the crawl spaces. I meticulously cleaned every nook and cranny, convinced that I must have missed something. But despite my efforts, the smell persisted, growing more intense with each passing day. One evening, while searching the attic, I found an old, dusty trunk I had never noticed before. It was a large wooden chest with intricate carvings, almost as if it were a relic from another era. The trunk was locked, but the smell was undeniably stronger near it. I hesitated, feeling a gnawing sense of dread. but curiosity got the better of me. I pried the trunk open with a crowbar, my hands trembling. Inside the trunk were old clothes, yellowed and tattered, along with several personal items, photographs, letters, and a diary. But what caught my eye was a collection of small sealed jars. The jars were filled with a dark, viscous liquid, and their contents had clearly been preserved for a long time. The sight was disturbing, but I couldn't make sense of it. I took the jars to a local lab for analysis, hoping to identify the contents. While waiting for the results, the smell continued to invade my home. I decided to contact a local historian to find out more about the trunk. The historian, intrigued by the find, agreed to help. He visited my home and examined the trunk and its contents. As he flipped through the diary and photographs, his face grew pale. The historian explained that the trunk once belonged to a family who had lived in my house decades ago. They had mysteriously disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions. The diary, he revealed, belonged to the family's matriarch, who had written about strange occurrences and a growing sense of dread before their disappearance. The most disturbing part was the diary's final entries, which detailed the family's growing fear of an unseen presence, something terrible that had been lurking in their home. The entries described the smell of decay that had grown unbearable, a scent that seemed to pervade the house and drive them to desperation. When the lab results came back, they revealed that the jars contained human remains, preserved in a gruesome and macabre fashion. The realization hit me hard. The smell I had been experiencing was not just a figment of my imagination or a seasonal odor. It was a lingering reminder of something truly horrifying. I was shaken, both by the discovery and by the eerie connections to the family's story. The historian and I decided to contact the authorities, who conducted a thorough investigation. They found no further clues about the family's disappearance or any additional remains. But the case was reopened, and the story made local headlines. Living in the house became increasingly difficult. The sense of unease grew stronger, and the smell seemed to cling to every surface, a constant reminder of the horror that had once occurred within its walls. I struggled to sleep, haunted by the thought of the family's fate and the unsettling knowledge that something terrible had happened in my home. The authorities eventually closed the case, but the story of the family and the macabre discovery became a part of local lore. I decided to move out, unable to shake the feeling of dread and the haunting scent that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. The new occupants eventually took over, and the house was cleaned and restored. However, the eerie history of the place remained a part of its dark past. To this day, I can't escape the memory of that smell, the scent of decay that lingered long after the trunk was opened and the remains were discovered. It serves as a grim reminder of the horrors that can be hidden in the most ordinary places and the unsettling truth that sometimes the past is not so easily buried. I've always been a fan of the convenience of online shopping. There's something satisfying about ordering a product from the comfort of your home and having it show up at your door. No fuss, no hassle. That's why I didn't think much of it when I received a package one October afternoon. It was a busy day, and I was knee-deep in work, so I barely noticed the delivery at first. The box sat there, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Just my name scrawled on it in block letters. At first, I thought it was something I had ordered and forgotten about, or perhaps a gift from a friend. It wasn't unusual for me to get unexpected packages now and then. I tossed it onto the kitchen counter and went back to my work, planning to open it later when I had more time. It wasn't until the evening that I finally got around to examining the box. By then, the day had cooled down, and a chill had settled in the air. I set the box on the dining table and carefully peeled away the paper. Inside, I found another layer of wrapping, this one a bit more ornate. A dark green velvet pouch tied with a gold ribbon. Curiosity piqued. I untied the ribbon and opened the pouch. Inside was a small, ornate wooden box intricately carved with swirling patterns and inlaid with tiny pieces of mother-of-pearl. It looked antique, old-fashioned, like something you might find in a dusty antique shop. The craftsmanship was impressive, but I couldn't remember ordering anything like it. I hesitated for a moment, then lifted the lid of the wooden box. Inside was a single item, a small silver key, perfectly polished and glinting in the dim light of the kitchen. The key was ordinary enough in shape, but it had an elaborate design etched into its shaft. It was unusual, but it didn't seem particularly menacing. I turned the key over in my hand, examining it closely. There was no note or explanation with the package, no indication of what the key was for or why it had been sent to me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the key. It was an odd thing to receive without any context. I tried to put it out of my mind and went to bed, but sleep eluded me. My thoughts kept returning to the mysterious package and its strange contents. The next morning, I decided to see if I could find any clues. I retraced my steps online, checking my recent orders and messages, but nothing matched the key or the box. I asked around with friends and family, but no one seemed to know anything about it. It was as if the package had come from nowhere. A few days passed, and the key still nagged at me. I began to feel a sense of unease, as though the key was somehow linked to something I should be worried about. I considered throwing it away or giving it to a charity shop, but something stopped me. I felt compelled to find out what it was for, even though I didn't know where to start. Then, one evening, I came home to find another package waiting for me. My heart sank when I saw it. Another plain brown box, just like the first one. I brought it inside, my hands trembling slightly as I opened it. This time, there was no velvet pouch or ornate wooden box. Just a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in the same neat handwriting. Find the lock. I stared at the note, my heart pounding in my chest. What lock? What was this all about? My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. The only lock I could think of was the old storage shed in my backyard, a relic from the previous owner of the house. It had always been locked up and unused, but I hadn't thought about it in years. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and anxiety, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to the shed. The shed was small, weathered by time, and its lock was rusty and old. I hadn't used it in ages, but I fumbled with the key I had received, hoping against hope that it might fit. To my surprise, the key slid into the lock and turned smoothly. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the lock clicked open. I pushed the door open, and the hinges creaked loudly in the still evening air. Inside, the shed was filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and dusty tools. It smelled musty, like mildew and decay. I shone the flashlight around, trying to find anything that might be of interest. The light flickered over a large covered object in the corner of the shed. With a deep breath, I approached the object and pulled off the covering. What I found underneath made my heart skip a beat. It was an old trunk, similar in style to the wooden box that had arrived with the key. The trunk was covered in dust and cobwebs, but it looked remarkably well preserved. I knelt down and opened the trunk, using the flashlight to illuminate the interior. Inside, there were various items. Old photographs, letters tied with string, and a few personal effects. At first glance, it seemed like a collection of someone's memories, a life preserved in dusty relics. But as I sifted through the items, something caught my eye. A small leather-bound journal, its cover worn but still intact. I opened it carefully, my hands shaking with anticipation. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches detailing the life of a man named Samuel Carter, a name I didn't recognize. The journal described various aspects of Carter's life, his work, and his travels. But there was one entry that stood out. It detailed a series of increasingly paranoid thoughts and fears, culminating in a final entry that was eerily relevant to my situation. It spoke of someone who was watching, who was waiting, and who would only reveal themselves when the time was right. My mind raced as I read the entry. The journal made reference to a final test, a way to prove oneself worthy. I couldn't make sense of it, but the sense of foreboding was overwhelming. The final lines of the journal mentioned a final key that would reveal the truth. I looked around the trunk, but there was no additional key or clue. The sense of danger and unease that had started with the first note had only intensified. The journal ended abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. I closed the trunk and locked it up again, my mind reeling from the discovery. The shed felt like it was closing in on me, and I hurried back inside the house, locking the door behind me. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sense of dread grew stronger, and I began to feel paranoid. I started checking the locks on my doors and windows more frequently, and I avoided going out alone. I tried to contact local authorities and historians, hoping someone could shed light on Samuel Carter and the significance of the journal. But there were no records, no information, and no clear answers. As time passed, I came to accept that I might never fully understand what I had uncovered. The package, the key, the journal, they were all pieces of a puzzle that didn't seem to fit together. But one thing was certain. The experience had left a lasting impact on me. I had been drawn into a mystery that I didn't fully comprehend, and it had made me question everything I thought I knew about safety and security. I moved the trunk back to the shed and locked it up, hoping to leave the unsettling experience behind. But the fear of what I had discovered lingered. The strange delivery had led me to uncover something dark and enigmatic, something that I could never fully escape. I learned to live with the unease, always feeling a lingering sense of being watched, of something just beyond my understanding. The strange delivery had opened a door to a world I wasn't prepared for, and though I had tried to close it, the echoes of that world continued to haunt me. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to superstitions, black cats, broken mirrors, ladders. None of it ever really bothered me. I considered myself a rational person, grounded in reality, with no time for old wives' tales or anything that smacked of the supernatural. That's probably why I didn't take it seriously at first when the warnings started. It was early September, the time of year when the weather starts to turn and there's a crispness in the air that hints at the coming of fall. I was returning home after a long day at the office, the first few leaves already crunching underfoot as I walked through the quiet streets of my neighborhood. It was a relief to leave the stress of work behind and enjoy the peaceful solitude of the evening. As I approached my house, I noticed something odd. There, on my front doorstep, was a small piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I picked it up, curious, and unfolded it to find a single word scrawled in red ink. Leave. I looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the street was empty. Just the usual row of houses, each with their lights on and curtains drawn. The paper felt strange in my hand, thicker than regular paper, almost like parchment. And the ink had a slightly smeared look, as if whoever had written it had been in a hurry. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of prank? A joke by some neighborhood kids? I crumpled the paper and stuffed it into my pocket, dismissing it as nonsense. My mind was too preoccupied with work, and I was eager to get inside, make dinner, and relax. But the note lingered in the back of my mind, nagging at me with a vague sense of unease. Who had left it and why? The next morning, I woke up to find another note. This one was tucked under my windshield wiper, waiting for me as I headed out to work. It was the same thick paper, the same red ink, but this time the message was different. Danger. Now I was really puzzled. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe it was some kind of marketing stunt, or perhaps a neighbor's idea of a sick joke. But there was something about the notes that didn't sit right with me. They felt personal, targeted, like someone was trying to send me a message that I couldn't yet understand. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The neighborhood seemed the same as always, quiet, unremarkable. My house was a modest two-story in a row of similar homes, nothing that would attract unwanted attention. But now, every time I came home or left for work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The third note appeared 2 days later. I found it taped to the inside of my mailbox, where I almost missed it. The message was short and to the point. Watch out. By this point, I was beginning to feel genuinely unnerved. The warnings were becoming more ominous, and there was no denying that they were meant for me. But who was behind them, and what were they trying to tell me? I considered going to the police, but what would I say? That someone was leaving me cryptic notes with vague warnings? They'd probably dismiss it as a prank, just as I had initially. I also thought about telling my neighbors, but I didn't want to alarm anyone without understanding what was really happening. Instead, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started staying up late, keeping watch from my living room window to see if I could catch whoever was leaving the notes. The first few nights were uneventful, and I began to wonder if the notes would stop altogether. But they didn't. One night, as I sat in the darkened room, my eyes fixed on the street outside, I saw movement. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, appeared at the edge of my yard. My heart raced as I watched them approach the house, moving stealthily, almost as if they were trying not to be seen. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as the figure reached my front steps. They hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching, and then quickly bent down to place something on the ground. Before I could react, they turned and disappeared into the night, melting into the shadows as if they'd never been there at all. I waited a few moments, my mind racing, before I finally got up and went to the door. I opened it cautiously, half expecting the figure to reappear, but the street was deserted. All that was left was the note. This one was different. The paper was the same, but the message was longer, written in the same hurried scrawl. You are in danger. Leave now before it's too late. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I read the words. This was no prank. Someone was trying to warn me. Someone who believed I was in real, immediate danger. But from what? From whom? I decided then and there that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to figure out what was going on. I couldn't just pack up and leave my home, my life, without knowing what I was running from. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started investigating. I began by asking my neighbors if they had seen anything unusual or if they had received any similar notes. Most of them looked at me like I was crazy, shaking their heads and assuring me that everything was as normal as ever. But there was one neighbor, an older woman who lived a few houses down, who gave me a different response. She looked at me with a strange expression, almost as if she knew something she wasn't saying. When I pressed her, she hesitated before finally speaking in a low, cautious voice. You should be careful, she said. This neighborhood is not what it seems. There are things that happen here, things that people don't talk about. What do you mean? I asked, feeling a chill of unease. She didn't answer directly, just shook her head and muttered something about bad luck and old secrets. I tried to get more out of her, but she quickly ended the conversation, clearly uncomfortable with whatever she was hinting at. Her cryptic words only added to my anxiety. What kind of things was she talking about? Was there something wrong with the neighborhood? Something hidden beneath its quiet, ordinary surface? And did it have anything to do with the notes? I spent the next few days on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I was no closer to understanding what was happening, and the fear was starting to wear on me. My sleep became fitful, plagued by nightmares in which I was being chased by faceless figures, their hands reaching for me, their voices whispering warnings that I couldn't understand. Then, one evening, I found another note. This one wasn't left on my doorstep or in my mailbox. It was inside my house. I discovered it on my kitchen counter when I came home from work. The sight of it sent a jolt of pure terror through me. How had it gotten there? I was certain I had locked all the doors and windows before leaving. The realization that someone had been inside my home, that they had left this note where I would find it, made my blood run cold. The message was stark and final. Last warning. Leave tonight. I didn't need to be told twice. Whatever was going on, whoever was behind the notes, it was clear that the situation had escalated. This was no longer about curiosity or trying to uncover a mystery. This was about survival. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and left the house without looking back. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere felt safer than staying there. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was following me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town over. I checked into a motel, paying in cash and using a fake name just in case. I didn't want anyone to find me. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with questions and fears. The next morning, I turned on the news, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain what had happened. But there was nothing. The world kept turning, just as it always had, with no sign of the danger that had driven me from my home. I considered going back, but the fear was too strong. I knew I couldn't go back. Not now, not ever. Whatever had been after me, whatever had prompted those warnings, it was something I couldn't face. I had to leave it behind, start over somewhere new, where it couldn't reach me. To this day, I don't know who left those notes or why they targeted me. I don't know what danger I narrowly avoided, or what would have happened if I had stayed. But one thing is certain. I'll never ignore a warning again. Some things are better left unknown. Some dangers are too real to dismiss, even if you can't see them.